Welcome back to Briggs on Books, our international talk show. What are you going to read next? We're going to help you figure that out, Briggs. We have a fascinating book and a fascinating author coming up right now. All the way, well, let's find out where she is. Anne Echols, welcome.
Welcome, thank you.
Tell us where you are now and where you usually are.
I'm in Atlanta, Georgia now, but I divide my time between Silver Spring, Maryland, and Atlanta. So Silver Spring is where my daughter, son-in-law, and grandchildren live.
Yeah. As far as a drive, do you drive or fly?
I've done both. It's about an 11-hour drive.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so I like to fly, but I can do the drive too.
Yeah, I've got an idea now what the distance is. By the way, here's the cover of your book, A Tale of Two Maidens. Tell us when it's set, what the genre is. Tell us a little bit about the book.
Yes, it's set in France in the late Middle Ages or early Renaissance, 1428, 1429. This is the time of the 100 Years' War, and Joan of Arc has risen to fame at that point. And it's a story that is historical fiction and shows an ordinary young medieval woman, Felice, an apprentice scribe, crossing paths with Joan of Arc. So it's a story, somewhat a coming-of-age story, and somewhat a look at how an ordinary person would view a very extraordinary young woman at that time.
I find this fascinating because I love to research Joan of Arc, and so you're going to put her in the picture, and we're kind of see how people might have interacted with her. That's a fascinating approach. The reason you're on the show is because I read something else about you. Is you spent some time developing or cataloging something. Tell us about that.
Yes, I think you're referring to our nonfiction books, yeah. Possibly. Yes, I got interested in the Middle Ages. I've always wanted to be a writer, but a good friend from college and I both wanted to write, and we were both interested in history and literature. So back in the 90s, we wrote two nonfiction books about women in the Middle Ages, because at that time there was very little written about ordinary women. There were books about famous medieval women like Eleanor of Aquitaine. So we wrote, and I'm going to show the audience, we wrote Between Pit and Pedestal, yeah. Women in the Middle Ages, and then we wrote an annotated index of medieval women, which is like a reference book that catalogs over 1,000 women from various walks of life, some famous, some obscure. And we really felt that it did fill a niche at the time, and I think it still fills a niche in the research.
Well, tell me how you went from that strictly research to writing the current book.
Inspired by many of the stories that I read in the research. So when you're researching obscure people, you have to go with little tidbits found in tax books and wills and letters. And I was just fascinated by ordinary life at that time. So I basically used the tidbits I found in my research and then did a lot of research on ordinary life in the Middle Ages, life for women in the Middle Ages, and developed, and also I traveled several times to France to actually see the places that Joan of Arc would have been. And I'm fascinated with old houses, old artifacts, and they're still there in France. And so I was able to draw upon that as well.
It's amazing how many old structures are there. You know, out here in California, we're amazed by the East Coast, how old the structures are. But jumping over to France, it had to be quite a difference, I would imagine.
It certainly is. It certainly is. And it's inspiring to think about people living in a tiny, dark home with just candlelight or the light from a fireplace, and, having a very wonderful life. So it's just very, very fun to time travel.
Yeah. I know you touched on it a bit, but tell me about the research for this book. You had to do additional research, I would imagine.
Absolutely. I had to really research the life of scribes at that time, what it would have been like to you spend your days copying books. I also had to research the 100 Years' War. We had done some research for that for our nonfiction books, but I had to really dip into that part of French history and, see a little bit from the two sides. The English and the French were basically fighting for which king would have the control of France. And before Joan of Arc appeared, it really did seem like France was going to be taken over by England. But she was very inspired by her voices of the saints to step in and fight for France to remain under the French king. I also had to do a lot more research on her. I read a lot of primary sources about her trials, people of that time, and what they said about her. So I really had to piece together who she might have been.
Were you amazed at the amount of primary source material there was?
There was some, but I would say that you have to look at those primary sources with a little bit of just a little bit of healthy skepticism, because they've obviously been translated. Her trial records might have been slanted toward the people who were against her, who wanted her to be taken out of power. So I would like to even do more research on, I think there's some very current books about her that I would really like to dip into as well.
Well, I'm fascinated by this. I'm fascinated by your research, and I'm excited to read this story. Even I only read nonfiction, but I'm going to read this because there's a lot of nonfiction in there, I would imagine.
Yes, I really had to, when you asked about how I made the transition to fiction writing, when I first began this book, it really did sound like a history book. But I was doing historical fiction. So my friends in my writers group really stressed, we don't want you to go on for pages and pages about this cathedral. We want you to get to the story. Yeah. So I really had to, as they say, cut to the chase and deliver the story. So I think I've made that transition.
That had to be tough, leaving some of that behind.
Yes, maybe there's another nonfiction book somewhere down the line.
You got enough material left for a whole nother book. By the way, where will we find this book?
It is available on bookshop.org, Amazon. I prefer to support bookshop.org because they really foster independent bookstores around the country, and I very much want to support independent bookstores. But you can also get it on Amazon. Some of the libraries have it available. I have it. It is being sold in local bookstores in Atlanta, and then I noticed also in Boulder, Colorado. I didn't see any California bookstores, but maybe that will be coming in the future.
Is there an audiobook yet?
There is not an audiobook yet. I'm strongly considering it. I myself love listening to audiobooks, and I feel like that I could get more of an audience that way as well.
If I get a vote, I don't know if I get a vote in this, but I always vote for the author to use their own voice on their own book. So, and you have a great voice, so it would work. It would work. Okay.
Well, maybe I'll consider that. Okay. And I do want to say too, there's a sequel to the book coming out in fall of 2025. Okay. So in that book, the main character is a bit older, and it's going to follow her story. Wow. Another famous woman in the background. Nice.
By the way, I have your web address on the screen, anneechols.wixsite.com/ATOTM. Anyway, it's on the screen. What would our viewers find there?
I have some information about the books. I also have discussion questions that can be used for book groups and classrooms. I think it would be a really great addition to educational studies classes so that professors could use it as a companion book when they're teaching issues such as diversity and women's issues, because it has both of those topics strongly in there. It also has a little bit about my background and a little bit about the two nonfiction books.
Okay. That we can find that on your website. By the way, we have a theme here on this show we've been developing. That is, when you go to order this book, don't order just one copy. Order 5 copies and be sure to give them out. Whenever I go to a party at someone's house, you have to take a gift. I take a book. This would be a good, I think a lot of people would enjoy this. Also, I've been pushing books with strong women characters, which it sounds like this is.
Yes, I definitely feel that the two main characters and some of the secondary characters are strong women characters. And I find in my research that there were, I think, the stereotypes about women at that time period. Sometimes we think those are the truth, but actually there's a lot of real women who did some pretty feisty kind of deeds back in that time period. Yes. So I tried to include as many as I could in this book.
Very good. Well, Anne, I could go on for hours with you because you're fascinating, but we're out of time. Any last thoughts, the last thing you want our viewers to know?
Well, I think that this book could be a crossover book for adults and for young adults. I think that it could be a real eye-opener for anyone interested in historical fiction as well. Right. So hope you enjoy my book.
And history itself. I think we'll get a lot of good, solid history out of that book as well.
Yes, indeed.
All right, and for our viewers, don't go anywhere because we'll be back with another author right after this. Thank you so much, Anne, and I hope we're back on the show again soon.
Thank you, Mike. I certainly enjoyed it.
My pleasure.
Bye.